Welcome back to my talk on the relationship between language description, typology, and natural language processing. I'm going to talk a little bit about the relationship between description and NLP specifically, using the example of coordination structures in Nuuchahnulth. First of all, why is coordination interesting? I think it's interesting because it is universal in human language. It tells us which elements are the same in a particular language. And sort of more typologically, serial verb constructions are a type of coordination that is very widespread around the world. So Nuuchahnulth has a few simple coordination constructions. The first of which is just listing. So you can just list verbs in a row, or you can list nouns in a row. You can use the word ahad, which coordinates verbs and nouns as well. And you can use the word ish, which traditionally only is used for nouns. These are actually not all that interesting. This is kind of globally typical coordination, and it's very well understood. But there are two more interesting types of coordination in Nuuchahnulth. The first is something called serial verb constructions. This is the use of multiple verbs within a single sentence and without the use of an overt coordinator, like an and or an or. And it has a perceived different meaning from and coordination. It is notoriously difficult to define what counts as a serial verb construction, or SVC, cross-linguistically. The second type of coordination structure in Nuuchahnulth is a linker construction. And this uses a suffix to coordinate a variety of structures. The methodology that I used for this work was firstly field work. So this is where you work directly with speakers. And I had people do a variety of tasks, describing images, question answering, translating from English, rephrasing existing sentences, choosing between different types of sentences, and evaluating examples that I constructed. I also used corpora study. These were from historical texts, contemporary texts the community produced, and texts from linguists, both myself and others. And then finally, this was implemented in a Delphin-style HPSG grammar, which is a machine-readable grammar description. So the steps are basically: first, find out what's going on in the language. Second, implement it in a computational grammar. And then third, go back to step one, because even though I presented this as though it was a linear process, it is not. This process was fairly cyclical. So rather than going through the discovery process, I will just give my results. I found 4 types of serial verb constructions, which all behave slightly differently, and I will just summarize what each of them look like. The first one I called simultaneity serial verb construction, and this is a construction where actions must occur at the same time. There are no ordering restrictions on which verb comes first, and they often, but not always, include a verb of motion. The most typical use case for this grammatical structure is to describe how someone moved from one place to another. Here's an example of this. I'm going to walk to Port Alberni. So there are 2 verbs here, and yatsuk, which are coordinated without any overt coordinator. Another example, the way to say just is do only. So he did only lying down. So he just laid down. The most interesting part about this serial verb construction, and others as we will see, is that a verb can be separated from its object by the intervening coordinated VP. So you actually already saw an example like this, example 1. Here I've changed the color coordination. For red, we have go to Port Alberni. Port Alberni is the object of go to. And in blue, we have the other verb, walk. As in English, in Nuuchahnulth, it would be ungrammatical to say, I am going to walk Port Alberni. The translational motion event has to be described with this verb, utzog, going to. I noticed that speakers seem to prefer verbs to match imperfectiveness with this type of serial verb construction, but elicitation results are very mixed. Perfectiveness is most easily thought of as verbs that are over and done versus verbs that are ongoing. And elicitation results were so mixed that the same speaker could give different judgments on the same sentence on different days. So instead, I turned to corpora study of naturally produced text. So here is the resulting table of that work. As you'll notice, the Nootka texts are about 100 years older than the texts I used of contemporary speakers. But if you look at the right-hand column there, there's been a gradual loosening of the restriction on perfectivity matching. So in contemporary Nuuchahnulth, about a third of the sentences fail to match in perfectiveness for this kind of construction. And in the old texts, it was much rarer. And in fact, the one example is a little bit marginal. The second type of SVC I called location and action. This still allowed for object separation as in type 1. There was no perfectivity matching constraint, and this is because locations are imperfective in both form and meaning. And there is an ordering constraint. Locations must occur first. So here's an example. The verb in red is the location. It is in fact a verb, be inside. So you have to say, we be inside working, not we are working being inside. The third type was used a verb that I called adposition-like plus an action. Once again, this allows for object separation, as I detailed on type 1. There is no perfectivity matching constraint, even though it is morphologically possible to do so. And there was not even a perfectivity matching constraint in the 100-year-old Nootka texts. And there is no ordering restriction on this verb type. So here is a typical sentence, do for work friendship center, and it is doing for the friendship center. So this sentence means, I hear she started to work for the friendship center. Friendship center. And again, we have this sort of typical object separation of these constructions. And finally, the last type I called sequential or separable action. These are serial verb constructions that can be interpreted as sequential and then constructions. There is no perfectivity matching required in this construction. So here is a typical example. Take it and put it away. This is a serial verb construction, as can be seen by the command morphology, which is shared between both verbs. And putting this in the other order yields something nonsensical. Put away, take would mean put it away and then take it, which is semantically bizarre. And maybe most interestingly, object separation becomes ungrammatical only in this construction. So here you have a pair. I chased the dog carrying the bucket. So I am carrying the bucket in this example. Here you cannot separate chase and the dog. These actions are separable from each other in a way that the other actions were not. They could be done at different points in time, chasing and taking the bucket. And so you cannot get the object separation that you see in the other serial verb constructions. So a quick summary. I'm not going to go over all of the differences, but just to draw your attention to type 4 there being quite different. It's the only one that's ordered temporally, and it's the only one that disallows this verb object splitting. What's the relationship with natural language processing? This is a talk about NLP. A lot of this real world data was actually only uncovered in the context of computational encoding. Specifically, the distinction between type 1 and type 3 was only confirmed by corpora analyses and putting the grammatical rules into a computer so that I could parse the two different the different sentences. And that's how I found out there were two different types. The distinction between them is very subtle, but it is present even in the 100-year-old Nootka texts. The coordination strategy that I used when I implemented this was based on previous work by Drelishak and Binder. I encoded it using HPSG, as I already mentioned. This is a lexicalist framework, so each of the 4 serial verb constructions target different lexical classes. So I had to have a group that was location verbs and another group that was apposition-like verbs. The object splitting is permitted by allowing some coordinations to inherit their daughter's complements. So this allows those complements to be realized in different positions. And then finally, the implemented grammar was then tested against held out corpora, as is typical in NLP. I had relatively low coverage of the corpora due to interacting grammatical phenomena. So remember, this is a rule-governed grammar. So the only sentences it can parse are sentences that have described constructions in my grammar. And since I was not implementing the entire grammar, and indeed it would have taken much longer than a PhD to do so, the coverage was a little constrained. So here's what I had. I had a coverage of 11% of naturally occurring sentences. My overgeneration was only 1 sentence, which I think, if I recall, was due to something other than serial verb constructions. Right, the second of the interesting coordination types is the linker. It's this morpheme, which is translated as meanwhile in Sapir and Swadesh 1939. And it is apparently part of speech insensitive. And what I mean by being part of speech insensitive is that it can occur on verbs, adjectives, nouns, and adverbs. So as you can see on the verb, we talked while driving. So tsekenk there is talk, treha driving, and you just stick it on driving. It can occur on an adjective. The bear was digging and strong. It can occur on a noun, which is hard to translate. There was a woman who kept gossiping, but it looks almost like being a woman and keep gossiping. And it can even occur on an adverb. I'm also bald, but I don't know it. So part of speech insensitivity, that's not just a property of the linker in this language. Verbs, nouns, and adjectives are actually all freely predicates in Nuuchahnulth. So here's an example of a verb predicate. He sees a drowning person. The predicate I will highlight in red in all of these sentences. That's kind of expected. We're used to that from languages we know. Here's number 11, beautiful the young girl. This is not a noun phrase, this is a sentence, and it means the young girl is beautiful. And then gym only, which means it's only a gym. And again, this is a perfectly grammatical complete sentence with a noun standing in the place that verbs will typically go. So the key to understanding what's going on with the linker was that when a non-verb has a linker attached to it, it must be interpreted as the subject. So here's a pair of sentences exemplifying this. Number 13, uwat ush, he found something, and it's kind of difficult but possible to get an interpretation where 13 means someone found it. And number 14, with the same sentence but with the linker attached to some, we get uwat ushq, find some linker, and this must mean someone found it. It is impossible to make it mean he or she found something. So I said nouns, verbs, and adjectives are all predicative parts of speech. The linker attaches to predicative parts of speech as well. And elements coordinated by the linker share a subject. So what is actually going on here is, if we translate this into a sort of semi-formal semantics, the sentence has uwat, which is a verb, find. That verb relates a finder, the subject, to something found, the object. And strange though it may seem, the word ush means some, and some is also a kind of event that has a subject. And the subject is the entity of which it is true that they are quantified as being some. So without a linker, you can get both subject or object interpretation. So find some. If we were to write this out in, again, the semi-formal semantics, we would have some finding event, which relates an X and a Y. And depending on whether we pick the subject or object interpretation, we either link the subject of some with the X argument, which is the finder, or the Y argument, which is the thing found. But the semantics of the linker constrain the interpretation to be only the subject. So find some link, we have the same finding event. And to be even more explicit, we have an event of being quantified as some, and the linker adds this additional thing that says, and whatever the subject is of that first element is the same as the subject of the second. And this way we get the constraint that the second thing that the linker attaches to, if not a verb, must be interpreted as the subject. Much like the SVCs, a linked predicate can separate verb and object. So here you have an example: I read at school, being at read school, the same sort of object separation. So when I come to implement this, it's a coordinating suffix with a few wrinkles. Those wrinkles are: the linker can occur in the second position with its coordinator. I didn't show this for time, but this is how you can get it on adverbs. Both the coordinands have to be predicative, which means that so long as each coordinand is headed by noun, verb, or adjective, they don't have to be the same type. This is how we can get it occurring on a noun and linking it to a verb. So the implementation implications were that I needed a super type of head called pred, which noun, verb, and adjective lexical items inherit from. So this is a bit of HPSG jargonese, but from a wider perspective, what this means basically is I had a super part of speech. So there are parts of speech, noun, verb, and adjective, but then there's a super part of speech, which all of them belong to, which I called the pred part of speech. I had the same inheritance of the leftmost coordinates complements as I did for SVCs to get that word order sampling. And I had to have two versions of the linker, because it turns out that the linker can occur either on the first coordinate or on the second. This is another thing that I did not discover until I had to actually implement this. And I suspect this is a limitation of the formalism. It seems strange to me to say that there are two coordinators, which are exactly the same, except one occurs on the first coordinate and one occurs on the second. But that's what I had to do to make this work. And finally, I had to have some method for handling second positional affixes, which I won't go into in any detail. So once again, I had held out test sentences. All of these came from speakers, either in elicitation sessions or in texts that I gotten from them. Coverage again was low, but again, this is coverage over naturally occurring text. So 12.4%, which is, I think, decent for a couple years' work. And overgeneration was quite low, again, at only one sentence. And this time it was a real overgeneration that should be an ungrammatical sentence. So in summary, from this little case study, what is the relationship between NLP and documentation? From language description to NLP, I got more flexible coordination strategies and more flexible predication strategies, these super parts of speech that united verb, noun, and adjective. From NLP in the direction of description, I got much more precise description of what was going on in Nuuchahnulth. And from NLP to formal theory, I was alerted to redundancies generated by the theory. I consider it to be a theoretical flaw, or maybe just a flaw in my analysis, that the linker requires two versions of itself in order to explain what is essentially the same phenomenon. So adding those arrows back into my diagram, NLP is a little more linked up with the rest of linguistic theory.